welcome and to all of you, wherever you're joining us today, whether you are in your office, home, driving, wherever you are, I'd like to welcome you and thank you so much for joining us on this webinar, which GGA, Good Governance Africa, is partnering in with the Mail and Guardian newspaper. My name is Lonwabo Patrick Gulati. I work at the Good Governance Africa. I'll be moderating this session today. The theme of our seminar is the State of the Nation Address 2025, More Promises, or Will We Turn the Corner? I have a team that I'll be discussing this with. The first person is Dr. TK Pua. He is a senior lecturer at Wits School of Governance. We also have another insightful, analyst here. He's a journalist, an investigative journalist at News 24, and his name is Mr. Kaya Koko. There's so many things I could say about him as well, but time does not allow. But welcome to you, sir. Good to have you. I also have Sis Bafedile Upape. She is an author. She is a former government senior official, executive, and a public service expert. I also have my colleague here, Dr. Ross Harvey. Dr. Ross Harvey works here at GGA, based in Cape Town, beautiful city. But he's our chief research officer, the guy who will make sure that our research and our views out there are based on credible research, analytical research, and I'm so happy to have him as my colleague and today as the panelist here. Welcome, Ross. Good to see you. I won't delve so much on the background because we all heard those who care about these matters. We all heard President Ramaphosa sort of where he outlined the medium-term development plan, identified the 3 priority areas, which is to drive inclusive growth and job creation, reduce poverty and tackle the high cost of living, and to build a capable, ethical, and development state. We're going to try and tease out some of the aspects that fall under these issues. But where I'd like us to start first with you, Kaya, is we have a government of national unity right now. Now, they are approaching their first year anniversary in a few months' time. How well is the media, especially your field, investigative journalism, doing in keeping track of government priority implementation? How well are we doing to make sure that when they speak and promise all of these things, there is a focus on tracking and for example, to what extent do you keep tabs with government's own evaluation and assessment of their performance? Can you share this? Can you share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the first time that we've had like a concrete plan with a medium-term development plan that you mentioned that was only announced after the cabinet Lekgotla in January and given concrete legs by the president during the State of the Nation address. So we'll be tracking. We'll start beginning to track the promises made and the implementation thereof moving forward. However, we can't obviously, as journalists, especially as investigative journalists such as myself, wait for the government to take out a plan before we do that. So ever since the new cabinet was announced in June last year, we've been looking into certain ministers and appointments, looking at whether they are fit for purpose in what they do. So I'll give an example for in my field of work. Recently in Jan and Feb, as the News 24 in the story that I wrote, we've looked into the minister in the presidency, Ms. Khumbudzo Ntshavheni, And I was able to unearth that the Hawks, which is the elite investigative unit in the country, has sort of finalized its investigation and is working now with the NPA in possible prosecution of the minister in the presidency. And she's a very important player within the cabinet of President Ramaphosa in that she oversees the State Security Agency, which is the SSA, the spies, and looks after the country's intelligence services. She's also responsible for government communications, as well as being part of the inner circle of President Ramaphosa, also chairing NAC Joints, which is the National Joint Operations Center, which involves the police, the army, the SNDF, the Hawks, and all of that to make sure that the country is secure. So she's a very high-ranking in the cabinet. You could say that after the deputy president, she's de facto second deputy president. And so with corruption and fraud charges pending against her, or possibly pending against her, that is sort of what I looked into and we unearthed as investigative journalists. So just to recap, in terms of implementing government promises, will only start as the media looking at it now with the medium-term development plan, which is a 3-year plan to get growth up to 1.9%, and by 2029, economic growth of about 3%. But so far, it doesn't mean we have to just wait for that to be implemented. We've also looked into ministers and certain senior public servants as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Clearly, already you're tightening the screws there. Colleagues, this is not the first time for us to hear the president giving us a set of promises. I counted, at least in my calculation, there are about 17 in this one. What do you feel about that? Do you have hope now that perhaps because we're under government of national unity, things are going to be better? Dr. Poor?
Oh yes, no, thanks for having us. Well, at least you still count. I stopped counting many years ago, so it's good that somebody is actually counting. And look, and the reason I say that is I think there's a bit of a disjuncture in terms of its expectation management, in terms of what we as citizens and what the president standing up gives. I think I've just come to a point where I think that when you speak to government, they tell that, listen, this is not really, it's meant more to rally the country, to kind of give a bit of insight into what's happening. And then the expectation is a minister of finance then is going to give us the full offering. But then I always tell them it's a bit confusing if you're putting it in that way. Then what's the point of having a state of the nation? Why don't you just simply put a cartoon there, give us description of what you hope's going to happen, and then we can all just move on with our lives. So I think there is a bit of a disjunction between what citizens expect and what we expect. On my end, look, I tend to really look at it more from and I think probably Dr. Harvey will probably agree with this more, is the question of the fundamentals of the society. And here we're speaking about things like local government, state-owned entities, health, education, which are things we all have numbers to and can readily even project what's going to happen. And with regards to that, I find that state of the nations are very unhelpful, are very not so helpful in helping us understand what we're really saying about this, because you can actually do your own projections to go forward. Now, the second part of your question of have I got with the fact that I still call it as a grand coalition, being trained in political science, I'd rather stick to facts as opposed to people's dreams of where they'd like to go. Because if it is a government of national unity, you then have to explain to me why Freedom Front Plus and its subsidiaries are going to the US saying other different things. But that's not what the discussion is about today. So look, this grand coalition for me, it's a bit immaterial whether it is there or it's not there. The key issue is government needs to run. And what I'm excited to see in this year is, are we actually going to see something different? Are these different ministers going to be able now to put their different visions forward? Because I can give them a bit of a break and slack to say, listen, they came in, you have to finish the former administration's programs. Now we're going to start to see, and I'm hoping to see in the speeches to come, in departmental plans, whether we're going to see anything different. So I don't use hope. Hope is never a strategy. I rather would go with what we see on paper.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much for that. Now, Dr. Ross, Harvey, Koko used the word, Kaya used the word concrete. What's your take? Do you feel that the SONA had enough meat into it? Or what for you were the key issues that you felt like there's a meat around here? Or what issues that you were disappointed with?
Yeah, great question, Patrick. So I did a kind of control find through the full text of the SONA to try and test whether actually I'd misheard or I heard what I wanted to hear or I didn't hear correctly and so on. Specifically with regard to whether there were specific things that I would have liked to have seen addressed in a concrete way. That weren't. And unfortunately, I found the word pledge or future tense present way too often. And that is a concern for me. What I'd like to see in a State of the Nation address is, look, these are the things that we laid out we would do in respect of the National Development Plan, for instance, and these are the specific numbers that we have met or we haven't met. And I think, unfortunately, there are too many pledges and too many promises. As you counted 17, Dr. Puri was maybe right to say, look, he's stopped counting. I think what I would really have liked to have seen in the address was a commitment to electoral reform and to real accountability. If you read that speech, just on the question of accountability, it's in a sense quite saddening that President Ramaphosa speaks about state capture as if he wasn't around at the time that it was happening. And I think there needs to be a stronger recognition, for instance, that the National Prosecuting Authority has really been stripped of capacity to execute prosecutions. And even if he were able to say, look, these are the high-profile cases that are before the court, and this is how far along we are, that would give the nation some appreciation, I suppose, or at least some confidence that we don't just have cathartic commissions and then don't actually prosecute on the back of the findings. But again, I think that the fact that there wasn't, there was some mention of professionalizing the public service, building a capable state. That's certainly in our 10-point plan that we had put together in the middle of last year. And so I was very pleased to see that there's at least language in that direction. But the proof will be in the pudding, right? With regard to that. What I didn't see and that I would really have liked to have seen, in addition to electoral reform, would have been a commitment to re-engineer the way in which our state-owned enterprises are governed. I would really like to see disaggregated interests represented as shareholders, and for government not to be the sole shareholder, and for the minister of that portfolio to essentially be the sole shareholder with too much discretionary power, because it essentially means that the board is appointed by the minister, and then that minister appointed board appoints the executive and the executive team. And I think that's a seriously unhealthy place to be as a country, especially given that, as Ramaphosa recognized in the SONA, the site of state capture was predominantly SOEs. And so I just didn't see enough about specific SOE reforms. We can talk all we like about electricity sector and logistics sector reforms, but I think we need to see changes in the underlying governance structures. And I think we need a commitment from that at the SONA level that are then actually executed in practice as well. And then lastly, Patrick, there wasn't a lot of commitment to, there are platitudes pertaining to local government reform. But again, concrete action is what we need here. Our municipalities are in a dire state, and anybody who travels outside of the Western Cape is increasingly appalled at the condition of service delivery infrastructure at the local municipal level. And that's where citizens really feel the weight and the rub of the lack of governance. Governance can be a very abstract concept, but you really feel it at the local level when it's not being practiced, because services don't get delivered, and that really compromises the quality of people's lives.
That's what
I'd prefer to see more concrete articulation of change, not just in generic terms, but actual underlying structural issues. So that would be my input on that.
All right, we're going to come back and tease out a bit more of those issues that you mentioned there, from state-owned enterprises to those kinds of issues. Now, Bafetile, I know we're going to delve into more later into the public service reforms and public sector professionalization, but just your thoughts, your general thoughts on the State of the Nation address, if you can share that with us.
Thank you. As the other colleagues have already mentioned, we have had these things for many times, and, to me, it's neither here nor there. And to be honest, I believe that whether there was meat on the speech or not, my belief is that with the current inefficient and ineffective, government service delivery machinery, which is the public service, we will not turn the corner. And there's just no sense of agency. And there's insufficient capacity and capability to translate what the SONA or the president is saying, in the SONA, to translate it into implementable actions. That is what is very important. We can talk and talk. And what I've also observed actually with the South Africans, maybe it may be different in other countries, is that we are actually more obsessed with politics. We miss to understand the real culprits when it comes to poor service delivery. The public servants who are the ones who are responsible for the implementation of the political agenda or the aspirations of the politicians. I wish, the South Africans themselves or the citizens of this country can start understanding where to look at, to ensure that there is improved service delivery. I'm not exonerating the politicians in terms of what is happening in the country right now in terms of poor service delivery. They are also responsible somehow or somewhere in terms of the failures that we are seeing. However, at least they come forward with what their aspirations are. So who fails is the public servants. Thank you.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much. I think we've gotten some broad stroke. The picture that I'm sensing from where I'm sitting is not a positive picture. It's not a positive picture. But I would like us to transition towards to say what can be done. But before we do that, I don't think we can avoid, because I think Bafetile has started on this issue. Now, Sean, I'd like you to play the clip now so that we can just have a look at that. And then, because if we don't look at the state capacity and capability, none of the things that we're going to be talking about can happen. All right. So can Sean, can you please play that short clip?
Ayiki politician in this country that will change anything with policy, with announcements, ongayishintshanga the public service employees. At least from the assistant director level up to the point of HOD or DDG. Those people are the ones who are letting us down the most. And the majority of those people are African. They are not black South African. Angiyazi le terminology siyithatha.
By the way,
We are
baningi
African.
abakhona khona la.
That's why I'm taking it on.
Yeah.
Those are the people who are letting us down. Bama toll gate ethu. When we do business, sidlula kubona, siyabanikeza izinto. They are even carrying excess weight. Bakhona la. You understand? Those are the people who are traitors to the liberation cause.
Imake Gombe, when you say sidlula kubona sibanikeza izinto, what do you mean?
Meaning they request bribes for any program and tender of government. There is nothing you get done just simply following due process. There is nothing. Ayiko into ongayenza, ungathandazanga, ungambribanga, ungayenza anything extra. Yabona when a president announces a program on a plan, don't think the delivery of that is straightforward. Not in this country, not with these public servants. It doesn't work like that.
Wow, we heard that. For those who didn't understand a bit of Zulu in between there, the main message is that the person is saying the big problem lies with the public sector. Is that a fair review of the public servants that are out there? Kaya, is that a fair thing? Is that not painting all the public servants with the same brush?
It is definitely a fair assessment, what that gentleman was saying, that nothing gets done, or very little, let me say, gets done in this country in the public sector with public sector procurement without someone paying for it. That gentleman, for those who don't understand isiZulu, was saying that as a business person, if you want to get government job, people from assistant director level right up to the HODs, which are the ultimate accounting officers, or the very senior public servants of a particular department or municipality. Those people require a kickback before you can do anything. If you refuse to supply that kickback, you won't get the business, which is why people who usually get the businesses or contracts with government are not qualified to do the work. Hence, you see infrastructure crumbling or so much poverty in this country. I'll give you an example, Mr. Kulati, and to our listeners as well. I recently published a story last week of within 2 years here in Gauteng, and within the social development department, about 600 million rand was misspent that had to go to non-government organizations dealing with providing food banks for people who are poor and can't afford monthly groceries, as well as children who who need school uniforms, school shoes, and all of those things. That money was given to unregistered NGOs by assistant directors, and senior HOD. There was a report that was done, a forensic investigation that was done by law firm Bowman's, that revealed that there were directors who were giving unregistered NGOs money to procure school uniform for the very poorest of children, including dignity packs. Dignity packs meaning sanitary towels for girls and young women who cannot afford sanitary towels for their monthly cycles. That money was chowed. And to show the lack of consequences for that amount of corruption, those same directors who were named in those reports are still employed within the Gauteng Department of Social Development. In fact, the person who was the head of department at the time now sits as a director general within the presidency. So there's no consequence whatsoever to corruption in this country. And for poverty, for inequality, and all of those nice things that the president mentioned, for that to be reduced, you need to deal with the civil servants. Sis Bafedile said it correctly, that the implementing agents of government policy and the funding are the civil servants, and they are the ones who are running amok, knowing full well that if there's an investigation done, that report will be buried until someone like me as an investigative journalist finds it, reports on it, and tracks them down. But still nothing happens because those people still remain in their jobs.
Sure. Yeah. I've got questions here coming through. I mean, I was looking at what the president said on this issue. I mean, this is the nub of the issue. And I'm going to come to you now, Dr. TK, and then the rest of the colleagues to say, what is the reason, the need then for all these policy pontifications and the state of the nation, if the real problem is not being addressed year after year? Because I would have thought that perhaps after the GNU, maybe things have changed. But what is coming out is that in terms of the public service, things have not changed. President Ramaphosa says he wants to strengthen the Public Service Commission's role in senior appointments. He wants to introduce a graduate recruitment scheme to attract skilled professionals to public service. But some of the people that were fingered in the state capture report were highly educated and capacitated. So I'm going to give you a chance to respond to all of these questions. Let me just refer to the ones that have been asked here. Totliso Mputi from ACDP is asking, what would a professional, efficient, and accountable public office look like in action? This question is for all of us, colleagues. What would a professional, efficient, and accountable public service look like in action? Terence Arense says to the panel, how ethical is this government of national unity on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the highest? Nangam Sokoko, I don't know if there's a relation here, but she says, are we ever going to live in a time where we witness proper electoral reform? This is what you're talking about, Dr. Ross Harvey, earlier on. And then she comes back and says, a fair and factual assessment when it comes to public servants who are employed to enrich themselves. Colleagues, you've heard the questions, respond as you see, but Dr. TK, let me start with you. What is the role and the purpose of all these policy pontifications if things are not changing on the ground?
No, thanks. I will directly answer, but I just want to respond to, I think, the question where, and I'll say this is a bit unfair mischaracterization of most civil servants, I think, and I know Mr. Koko said that, in that I think it's an easy way to say that, but when you've actually, I was once an aspirant civil servant. When you're actually in that realm, I think sometimes people simplify it a bit too easy to say, well, there are these corrupt civil servants, and then if you got rid of all of them, things would work. What they then miss as a point is to say, and this is where I think I do have a bit of a problem with our journalism sometimes, is when you look at the historical nature of how we got there, we never get to the point where we said, listen, how are these people appointed? And it's no longer a debate, is the role of unions and politicians in the appointment of civil servants. People miss that part.
The role of what?
Unions and politicians in the appointment of civil servants. That whole process has literally been, I would say it literally has been, I'm trying to find nice words which are diplomatic, because I know we're going to probably touch on those words. But if we're to use sewage, it has been quite clogged up. And we never look at it from that position, because sometimes we speak about the end effect. Where's the question which says, and I think Dr. Harvey sort of touched on this, to say what we should be asking is, how do we literally get to the point where we depoliticize how people and civil servants are appointed? We don't want to touch on that one, because that's a bit of a tough one, because then we'd have to ask the question and go a bit further. And this is maybe touches on your issue of pontification, of we ask our civil servants to have these high moral standings, these qualifications, but we never ask the same of our politicians. And by that, I mean in law. And I think Dr. Harvey will correct me if I'm wrong in Bafedile, is that the hiring of politicians, in terms of, especially I know at local government level, the MFMA and the like, and the Municipal Systems Act says nothing about the need for politicians to have qualifications. Nothing, zero. But you would want the same. So you want somebody who has come through the system, a politician, who sits at the table to say whether I would want to hire a Mr. Koko or not. And this same politicians at the regional level, and here we have to be very honest, this maybe speaks more to the ANC, the regional areas, and say, no, we know this Koko guy. He said nice things about us. And it's done. And then the unions will simply just support this. So I think the issue of saying, yes, look, civil servants are those who are truly should not be in the system. But for me, I say, if you really want to address the issue, let's go back to how politicians and the role they play in appointment of officials. That role, I think, has not been clarified enough. And if anything, we should be getting politicians out of that so that the civil service is independent, hires the right people. So until we get to there, it's a bit unfair to mischaracterize all civil servants as those. And I think there was a question from from the SADP who said, listen, how would you address that? I was with students yesterday. I was with the former chairperson of SCOPA in the Northwest, and they told me about their version of SCOPA when they went on an oversight visit in Portugal. And they said, listen, what you then do is you make it an independent body. You start it with prosecutors and law enforcement so that when those issues come, right there and then they get addressed. We don't wait for our systems in the law courts, in the court systems to be dragged out for the longest time. So for me, the issue, what you're saying is we pontificate, and I think Bafedile was right, because I think in a way, South Africans are not caught up to the issue that politicians run the show. We literally are always running after politicians. And until we get to the point where we say, listen, let's pause, and this system, let's depoliticize the system, and then actually address key issues, we're always going to be running after politicians and blaming sometimes the wrong individuals. And I know Dr. Harvey would know this well, if the work we've done with state-owned entities, if you really look at why state-owned entities went the wrong way, those were politicians. What they do very well is they politicize the board appointments, and they put people they know. They might have qualifications, like you say, Patrick, but it's people they know who know that they're not going to push back. So I think let's look at this from probably an objective and more a research-informed analysis, and then let's make the critique. Because currently, I think sometimes it's a bit too easy to say, let's get rid of all civil servants, and we're missing the point.
All right. I think you've made your point now. I'm going to come to you, Bafedile and Dr. Harvey. You take it whatever way you want. And I think your passion, Bafedile, is in this area. I think even your book talks about this. You spent your years as a senior public service servant, who yourself, when I read your book, came across to me as a person who was highly ethical, highly professional, efficient, and dedicated to her work. What are your views on this question?
Thank you. Actually, let me start by the question you asked, to say that should we paint all the public servants with the same brush? And I'm saying no. There are some intentional public servants. However, the majority of the public servants are what we are questioning. So also someone asked to say that every time we sit and listen to SONA, is it necessary to have all these things if we are not achieving anything out of them? And I'm saying, remember, the politicians, they have a role to play, which is to come up with the aspirations for the country, to say, for example, we want a better life for all. Yeah? So that better life for all should be made real, and this is done by the public servants. So there is in government what we call a planning cycle. So SONA is part of the planning cycle, because if there is no SONA, so what direction will we take as the country? Where will we go without guidance from the politicians? So we need the SONA to spell out what the country needs or seeks to achieve. Remember that there is nothing wrong. Sometimes, we'll say something is wrong when actually that thing is not the one that is wrong. So just because we are having difficulties implementing the SONA does not mean that the SONA is wrong.
Okay.
And then lastly, when it comes, someone asked about what a professional a public service should look like. And TK, you also touched on that. Like the public service that is a professional public service is the one that is not politicized. It is true right now that we are here as the country because the public service has been politicized. And if you recall, in the first and the second administration, the situation was not like this, but it started happening somewhere, or start showing the cracks, this system of government, when the public service get politicized. TK, you talked about the appointments of and the interference of the unions in the appointments, the politicians themselves. So what I'm saying is that a public service that is not politicized constitute a professional public service. I mean, yes, a professional public service. And you see, if we are a country that will not allow politicians to interfere or to get involved in the management of the state resources. And that's another thing that the people need to understand. We have the government, then we have the state. The government are those politicians, they come and go, but the state remains to implement the agenda of any party. It doesn't matter which party, but they are always there, whichever party comes in, or the GNU now. So we need to have those capable public servants to deliver on the mandate of those politicians. So I think maybe let me stop here. But the other thing is that there is one thing that the public servants do not understand. They don't understand the power that they have over the politicians. And I'm saying this because power normally is associated with money. And who's holding the state purse? It's the public administration or the state. That's why even with the Zondo Commission, we didn't say that we said that it's a state capture, not a government capture, because it's the state that holds the purse, not the government. The government are those politicians that are there, just to give us political direction in terms of what needs to be achieved. The last thing I want to say is that, you see, it's very important that we have, in the midst of the public service, the public servants who will understand the political mandate so that they are able to implement it. Because if you are a public servant but you don't understand the political mandate, then you are going to go to Mamelodi and concentrate on Mamelodi, when Mamelodi, for example, is not a political priority to do what you are doing. Maybe let me stop here. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Ross, you've heard the questions. There was a question about electoral reform, where, are we ever going to live in a time when we do that? Please define for us, what does it mean? But also, you can also respond in all the questions that have been put forward so far.
Yeah, great, Patrick. To be honest, I think that electoral reform is actually, I'll say this somewhat controversially, I think that it's at the root of many of our problems. And so I'm glad that it did come up in the questions. What we mean by electoral reform is that if you consider the extremely low voter turnout and the results of the last election, which wasn't that long ago, we're looking at May last year, the lowest voter turnout in South African history as a proportion of eligible voters. Now, that's an expression of people having lost faith in the current system, even if they at the same time express confidence in the values of democracy, which they do, according to Afrobarometer surveys and so on. But there's a disjunct between how people feel democracy is serving them and their desire to see democratic practices enacted. And so what you got, certainly in the results, were a grand coalition, not a genuine government of national unity, as Dr. Tiko pointed out earlier. And the issue there as well is that, a lot of commentators have stated that this was a vote in favor of good governance and in favor of rooting out corruption and a vote for more accountability. But if you look at the demographic spread of the vote, it's patently clear that that is not actually the case. MK and the EFF garnered a large proportion of the vote that would arguably otherwise have gone to the ANC. And that was largely along ethno-nationalist lines. And that's not a healthy situation for our democracy to be in. And now research suggests, and it's open to question, that the reason we land up in this situation is because there's a huge disjunct between voting and then what ultimately happens. So under a proportional representation system, just briefly, we vote, but the party then chooses the candidates according to their own list. And the voter, him or herself, doesn't actually have any control or influence over that process. And so those politicians only feel accountable to the top six or, whoever they feel is influential within the party. And that means that they don't necessarily have an incentive or an interest to then engage in a manner that provides good political direction to the country. In addition to that, and partly I think because of the deteriorating quality of political leadership over the last 20 years, we haven't seen a politico-administrative divide, and that's a lot of what we've been talking about thus far in the webinar pertains to this concept of a politico-administrative divide, an operation running on two parallel tracks, if you like, with some interaction, but largely separated. But you need high-quality political leadership that are accountable to citizens on the one track, and then you need an independent, professionalized public service that, as Fabile just said now, it can actually stand up to politicians and say, sorry, Mayor, we're not doing that, because that's against the code of our professional civil service. There is a civil service framework in place, professionalizing the public service 2022. That framework really needs to be implemented, but nothing in this country will get implemented without political will. And for as long as our political will, if you like, collectively, even within the GNU, is subject to party considerations rather than to citizens' needs, I think we're going to continue to have this problem. And so our recommendation at GGA, anyway, is that we should call for electoral reforms that have been put on the table to actually be implemented. It works relatively well at the local level in that respect. It's not to say that it manifests in better public service delivery, but that's a complicated issue. But we need to move to a system where more of our politicians are actually directly voted for. I'm not suggesting that we move to a flat-out majoritarian system, but we do need more direct accountability. And I think that's the bottom line when it comes to this question of political reform.
I want us to do a transition, but before we do that, there's one comment here which I want. But there's also among the priorities that the president mentioned, the issue of local government reform, where he says the development of an updated white paper to modernize the local government system is in place, and establishing ring-fenced utilities for water and electricity services to ensure investments, and reviewing the funding model for municipalities to enhance their viability. And I think the issue that you're raising there, Ross, is the issue of implementation and political will. And so what Siseko Maposa is saying here is if we appreciate research on corruption's economic impact, a 4 to 5% drop in corruption levels could boost South Africa's economic growth by around 2.8%. We seriously need stronger anti-corruption enforcement. Siseko, I guess the scholars here would be in a position to tease out and to look carefully at what you're saying, but I can also share with you that as Good Governance Africa, we are part of a global movement for the establishment of an international anti-corruption court. We have a program that's running along those lines, and I think this is a matter that is key in terms of that program, because corruption is a big problem in our country and in our continent. Now, before we transition to this other issue, I'm coming to you, Dr. Poe and Kaya, and then we move to the other issues around economic growth. Now, the government, we're talking here about public service reform and the delivery of these priorities that the government is talking about. But over the last 3 years, our government have been undergoing a systematic tightening of the belt, where budgets are cut, where there are things that are being slashed. Is there no disjuncture between that and what government is trying to do? I remember I was working elsewhere where we're providing services that government was sort of partnering with them. We were informed that, listen, there's going to be a huge, about 87% cut of this thing because there's a directive that has come from the presidency and the treasury. So how do you balance the belt tightening measures, which are trying to improve the efficiency, financial efficiency of the state, and what needs to be done by the public service? Let's start with you, Dr. TK, and then come to you, Kai.
Oh, no, thanks for that. Yeah, the question of austerity,
Yes.
how far you go. Look, it's a difficult one, because when you speak to economists like Duma Trobule, he goes on a different stroke and says, listen, we should be able to be spending. And if you look at where our percentages in terms of where South Africa is with regards to other countries, there is scope for that. And then obviously there is what we can now term the treasury position, because treasury is a bogeyman all across the world for austerity. But I think, look, based on research, and I'll just use the UK, for example, you can see austerity has literally hampered the British economy. So it's a question of, we do need to cut, but it's always a question of where. And this is where the big debate is. And again, I'm going to go back to the issue of, and this is my personal view, and I've always pushed this across. I don't understand why we have 278 municipalities in this country. I don't understand why we've got provincial government. So when we always discuss austerity, it's easy to go for soft targets, right? It's easy to go for social welfare and those things. And I understand that we do need to have a debate around there. But
I don't know where, but you would remember that we, at some point, we had over 800 municipalities.
We need to cut more.
Before we came to where we are. Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, no, there's a paper I've worked on which says, look, in truth, and using Gauteng doesn't need as many municipalities as it has. And if you look at the question of metros, just to be a bit more blunt with the policy, I think a lot of metros we have can really be expanded upon, and we can actually give them a bit more discretion and power to actually work as economic engines, where we don't actually get in their way with regards to many things. The key problem is those municipalities in rural areas, where you're asking a municipality, maybe Tata in those areas, and even in the Northwest, to say, listen, create economic development. But when you look at the budget and you look at the professional levels that are there, it's very hard to do that. So I think we do need to relook at municipalities. And also the question, which we always try to escape in South Africa, of provincial government. I was doing the calculation, say, if you look at how much we're paying to provincial government, and also the skills which we could otherwise use at local government level, we literally are, it's almost as though we're speaking about the two different languages around the issue of economic growth and development. I think if we put it in that way, and we actually were to say, how do we thoughtfully literally start to think about what type of local government we want, How do we cut down on provincial government and start to put a lot of those resources back at local government level? I think that's where you can get our growth and development. And then there's an issue which we all know it, but I don't understand why we have so many, and this is where the Western Cape and I think partially KZN, their legislatures, in terms of why do we have so many politicians? Why don't we cap the number as per the population, right? Because for me, I do not understand why Gauteng has to have so many MECs. I don't understand why we have so many provincial legislatures, and also the National Assembly of and by itself. Why do we need that specific number, right? The Indians kind of do it on a calculation basis, and this informs how they make national ministries. Where's that debate in our country? Well, I'll be writing a book on this, so maybe add self-advertising as well, to say we do need to look at it that way. So I think if we're saying we're cutting down on government, I think we need to cut down on the things which we know are not really that important and we could do without. This is provincial and curtailing of local government. And then the third thing is, politicians. There's a joke, how many politicians do you need to run the economy? Well, Singapore kind of shows us that less than 10 is actually a desirable number. So that's where I would go with the question of economic growth. And then there's also the issue which I think we're kind of avoiding because we don't quite know how it to work, which is to say, why aren't we more of an export-orientated country? And where is the idea of critical raw minerals and beneficiations within the state? Because that's what basically critical raw minerals is it's just something called, in other words, it's just called beneficiation. Well, we've not updated our laws. We've not updated our industries. And the one thing, and I know this is a controversial point to make, but I'll defend it later on as I finish this part, is the one thing we should be thankful to Donald Trump for, or President Trump for, is he's literally exposed where South Africa's economy has been for the last 30 years. We have not invented stuff. We are still stuck in digging up stuff and sending it overseas. We have not, I think, diversified our portfolio of export countries to the levels where we should be. For instance, our farmers, yes, look, the AGOA is great, but if you really do the calculations on AGOA, we should have been pivoting towards the Middle East for a lot of that stuff. I know government started to do it towards the previous administration, but we need to do it more. So I think, look, the future of our economy is not going to be in place. Look, we must keep the Europeans happy, we must keep the Americans happy to a degree, but the future of our economy is going to be in the Middle East. It's going to be in places like the ASEAN areas, because that's where the next big middle class is coming. So the question is, what do we give and what do we build to get into those industries? And I think that's where we're lacking.
Okay, I'm going to come to you now, Kaya, but just for those people at home or in their cars or in their offices that just joined us, this is a webinar where we're just unpacking some of the key issues that our panelists have identified from the State of the Nation address by the President as we prepare for the, for the budget speech by the Minister tomorrow, Minister of Finance tomorrow. We have here with me Dr. TK Pue. We also have got Mr. Kaya Koko and Ms. Bafedile Upape and Dr. Ross Harvey. He just disappeared, but he probably is going to come back. I had mentioned that, Kaya, that I also wanted to hear your view on the issue of the state capacity. But I just want, now that Dr. Pue has moved us towards the discussion on the economy and economic development and so on, I just want to link the two. President Ramaphosa talked about a nation with a thriving economy that benefits all. He wants to create this virtuous, what he calls a virtuous cycle of investment, growth, and jobs. And then he says we want to lift economic growth to above 3%. All right, let me hear your thoughts about the possibility of that and what would need to be in place for these aspirational objectives to be achieved. It's up to you if you want to start with the capacity question that I started with, but I want us to segue towards the discussion on the economy.
Well, they are interlinked. All of those things are interlinked, Mr. Kulati. The state capacity if a capable state will create enabling conditions for the economy to thrive. So I don't think those things are mutually exclusive of each other. It's always a debate on what the number the magic number is to get to RE economic growth in order to lower the levels of unemployment. I saw Stats SA release the latest quarterly figures for the last quarter of 2024, October, November, December 2024, showing that our unemployment is at 31.9%, and the National Development Plan, which is a document that was, I think, adopted sometime in 2010, 2011, 2012 at the ANC's Mangaung conference in December 2012. It spoke about a 5% annual economic growth to take unemployment to less than 10%. I see now the president is talking about 3% by 2029. So those projections have obviously been lowered, and a lot of that has to do with a failed state capacity. Austerity will not work. Cutting critical social services in order to rein in spending will do what TK mentioned earlier. What happened to the UK? The Labour Party came back into government not because Keir Starmer was a good candidate. There wasn't a sweeping vision of it, but just people got tired of the austerity that was done by the Conservatives, that side, the Tories under David Cameron and successive Tory governments that just cut spending. I saw Action SA saying that there needs to be 20 departments, and I partially agree with that. Less than 20 departments, because if you have a minister, then there's a ministry. And with the ministry comes a department which needs to be staffed and all of that. And if you cut down that, however, with union, with the union involvement in the running of the state, it's going to be pretty hard to start cutting ministries, because that will mean job losses in the public service. And if you look at how unions and people have protested over the years, when there's been even a mention, forget the cutting, even a mention of cutting of the public service, it could end up being violent. Just to add on to what I said earlier regarding the civil servants, just to wrap it up, it wasn't to say that all public servants or civil servants are corrupt. In fact, I mentioned that the gentleman who was speaking at the Gagasi panel discussion had said that it's mostly at the level of assistant director going up to HOD. I mean, my mother was a civil servant, so I have nothing but respect for the civil service. However, it is correct to say that the higher you go up in the civil service, the more corrupt it becomes, and that is based on research that I do on a daily basis. We could have the argument that TK wants about union and political involvement in the appointment of public servants. And it's one I've written about extensively, for example, at schools, the appointment of school principals and the running of the governing body. That is a lot to do with how the South African Democratic Teachers Union and how the National Education, Health and Adult Workers Unions are running the show that side. You'll find, to give an example of something I've done, there's a school in Katlehong that allowed for there to be theft of 10 million of 10 million rand that was supposed to be used to buy books, calculators, renovate the school's chairs and new classrooms and all of that. And nothing happened to the principal or the governing body members who were involved, particularly because those people were handpicked by the unions and by extension their political friends, seeing as that Nehao and Satu are in alliance with the governing party, which is the ANC. So to paint the civil servant as and I saw Makgoba, there's a comment from Makgoba who said that certain managerial position and director positions are 5-year terms linked to political terms, and that's it incentivizes those civil servants to be loyal to politicians rather than the people they are meant to serve. And I totally agree with that. Adding on to what Ross had mentioned earlier about electoral reform, I'm totally in agreement with a constituency-based rather than the current system we have of proportional representation, because that allows members of parliament and MPLs to be loyal to the political parties rather than the people. And that's why people don't vote. You often hear people saying that, I don't know why I'm voting for. The actual thing that they're saying is they don't know who they are voting for, because they're just throwing their votes in the ether, and the political parties make their choices. So all of those things are tied to economic growth, and it's all of them are included of each other, two sides of the same coin. If we get a capable state with a professional civil servants that creates an enabling environment for economic growth, for people to innovate, for me to open a spicer shop, and or whatever, that will drive economic growth. But for as long as we have this constrained, bloated cabinet, a bloated parliament, bloated provincial legislatures, bloated municipal council, all of that will, unfortunately, constrain innovation and, by extension, economic growth.
Okay, I'm going to come down now towards, as we wind down towards the end of our conversation, but it's fascinating stuff. Think about it, Ross and Bafedi. Do we need a department of government efficiency like we have under Elon Musk in the US? I don't know, but now there's another comment here from Toy Marokwane, who says consequence management is important to enhance good governance. And I think this has been mentioned a lot, that this issue of consequence management is not happening. We are seeing ministers that remain in government, court case after court case. If they don't resign, no one's going to take them out. I've got also Dr. Stanley Maposa. Good to see you, sir, man. It's been a while. He says, gun violence was mentioned. How is that affecting implementation, service delivery, sustainable development, and the safety and security of the vulnerable majority? This speaks to the issue of peace and security, or crime prevention and things like that. And then Utlotliso Puti at Mail and Guardian says, how can we balance the interests of different stakeholders, especially when they have competing goals or priorities? We've seen that within the GNU right now, there are different priorities and goals there. How is this going to be done? Terence Arense comes back and says, my opinion is that the president is in no position to talk about corruption when the Phala issue has not been resolved satisfactorily. This is a huge load on Ramaphosa's forehead. It's until it's resolved. Clearly, it's going to be a big issue. Mukhaba Tsebe says 5-year contracts tie senior managers to political superiors, fostering loyalty over ethics due to personal ties, undermining accountability and governance. Bafedile, please, I would like you to make a specific reference to this. I'm going to come to you after this. This issue of ties and the ties to the politician because of your contractual arrangements. And then Terence says, agree with the panelists that a two-tier system can work, of government can work, and that the provincial government can provide too much needed funds and staffing. The reduction of the cabinet will be a start. All right. TK responded on the chat as follows. TK, you engaging. Thank you, man. You are right, talking to Terence. You are right. We have a full-blown crisis in education, to be specific, public education, because the private sector, not always great, is booming. We need to redress the crisis now. The conversations are happening, guys. Those of you who have not yet made your comments, please submit your comments. We want to hear. Our panelists are here. Let me start with you, Bafedile. You've heard what we've said so far. And Ross, you've heard what we've said so far. Can you respond to that first question, Bafedile? But to you, Ross, I want just to add a little bit of the economic issues nuance, which is about there is this 3% target. There are targets like 950 billion rand over the next 3 years for infrastructure. And all those kinds of things that have been mentioned there, things like bridges, ports, all of that. Do you think those things are possible? Let me start with you, Bafedile.
Thank you, Chair. Before I talk to the issue of contracts, I would like to chip in as well on that issue of budget cuts, and
Yes.
And the fact that the president will say the country would like to reduce whatever with so many percentage. Earlier on, I talked about the type of public servants that we need to have. You see what is also lacking in the public service are strategic leaders or strategic leadership. The people that, as I've said earlier, that will be able to translate what is being said in the SONA, when we say 3% of whatever, then the people who will be able to look at the resources that they have and align them with the work that needs to be done. What I found lacking in the government is that simple things. Think of your own home where you have your budget, how you run your budget. These are the same principles that need to apply even when you are a leader in government. Because if we are required to do certain things, but when we look at the budget, we realize that we don't have enough. And I think TK said it earlier on, we need to prioritize. And in the process, sometimes you even need to reprioritize because there are new emerging things that come as we go on. So that is the biggest problem in government. We can't align the budget with the strategy or whatever needs to be achieved. So when we appoint or we do recruitment and selections, those are the criteria that we need to look at to say, we need people who can, do operations management or who are capable of operations management. So on the issue of contracts, firstly, I always hear people confusing. I'm not saying this one as well. I always hear people talking about there are political appointments in the office of the ministers. Of course, it is true, as Kaya said, that there are those like the DGs. Normally, they'll have 5-year contracts. Previously, actually, we used to have, even if I recall, if I'm not wrong, even the DDGs, their contracts were 5 years. So, but let me get to the ministers' offices. Yes, there are two ways. Either your appointment gets aligned to the minister's term of office. But recently, they've also introduced that you can be appointed in the ministry by contract, so that your contract gets, because we end up having people who remain in the office of the ministers when the ministers leave, when they are reshuffled. Then we don't know what to do with those people. So this reform has helped the government to deal with such people. So the DGs, yes, they will be appointed on contract, but as far as I'm concerned, I haven't seen, I could be wrong, but I haven't seen any challenges in terms of the relationship of the DGs with the minister, unless I don't understand the question. But the only problem with the 5-year contract is that there is no continuity. You can't expect, to have such big priorities from SONA, and then you expect that this can be achieved within 5 years. So that's the challenge that I have, or the worry that I have with the contracts of the DGs. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. You heard the question there, Ross. Tell me if you want me to write, and I'd like you to hear your views as well, Dr. Pue, as well as Mr. Koko. This issue of are we ever going to achieve these targets? I mean, Koko said earlier on the president was more specific and concrete, and to some extent I agree. I mean, he had a number. He even mentioned the names of the water projects that are going to be done, the number of kiloliters that are going to be done. So, which is okay, I give it to him. But we've got 950 billion rand that's going to be spent over the next 3 years. Do we have the capacity in terms of the state, but also in terms of partnership with the private sector? What are your views about whether we are going to be able to deliver on these projects?
Yeah, great question, Patrick. I'll start there and then move on to some of the broader questions around the health of our economy. I think that expenditure capacity is really a big deal, and it's a significant problem given the very clear evidence that we have a lack of a capable state, and precisely because we don't have professional public servants, as has been mentioned by all the panelists, it's very difficult to foresee that kind of infrastructure investment will actually come to fruition or produce the kind of economic fruit that it could. If you consider that over against what's happened in the city of Cape Town, where the rollout of infrastructure investment is very closely tied to municipal performance, because the continuation of the loans from the World Bank depend on having very high average municipal repayment rates, and citizens don't pay unless they can and unless they feel like they are getting services, and they need rates repayment rate of above 95% in order to not have those loans cut, and it's those are serious conditions under which to be operating. My concern with the president's proclamation is that these things have been promised in the past, even those kind of numbers, but the funds kind of remain unfilled, and the money doesn't actually go into the funds, and then you think, okay, but what is this thing? Is there an actual vehicle here that is tied to a contract, and is that contract tied to real performance measurements? So I have my concerns. Nonetheless, the idea obviously is sound in that you really have to improve logistics and infrastructure in every sense, on every level, if you are going to create a thriving economy. But at the same time, you need an economic plan. And so when it comes to this proclamation of inclusive growth, 3%, even if we get it, and that's at odds, by the way, with the Treasury projection of 1.7% growth for next year. And at the moment, we're below 1%. Now, per capita, that means we're actually in negative territory. And when you consider it against inflation, we have no net real growth. And that is a serious concern for me. You know, inclusive means labor absorptive, to put it in very blunt economic terms. And if your economy is not growing in labor absorptive sectors, then we are going to continue to have socio-political and socio-economic decay. And so I think the focus really needs to shift towards investing in sectors that are likely labor absorptive. And there are all kinds of things that have to happen for that to become a reality.
Yeah.
But I don't think that there's sufficient attention being paid, for instance, to what this could actually look like in concrete terms. You know, there was a reference to the mining sector, you know, becoming a sunrise industry and so on. But, you know, we've advocated for mining policy reform in very detailed fashion that has not been taken on by the DMRE. And we need to connect mining to industrialization, for instance, because that's where your labor absorption can occur. Look, it's difficult to ascertain whether we could actually grow employment there because of our poor education outcomes. But nonetheless, you need a plan that connects mining to industrialization in sensible ways. You know, that doesn't just say, oh, we're going to beneficiate everything. We don't have enough electricity to beneficiate raw material willy-nilly. We need an actual strategy and then capable people who can execute that strategy. But on this question of budget and education outcomes, I think one of the things we really need to also examine is the efficacy of our expenditure. You know, I have a lot of sympathy for the arguments against austerity, but I think that in our current situation, our expenditure is not particularly effective. We spend a lot of money as a country as a proportion of our GDP, both on health and education, and the outcomes are poor, really shoddy. So that just shows that there's ineffective spend. It comes back to the corruption question that's been raised in the chat. A lot of that money is diverted for private gain, and that literally comes at the direct expense of citizens. Plus, we spend more, as a portion of our budget, we spend more of it on servicing debt than on any other single issue. And that's also a big concern for me. You know, we're sitting at above 70% in terms of our debt to GDP ratio. In other words, 70% of our debt stock is worth 70% of what we produce as a country in terms of goods and services in any given year. And we don't have the kind of economic engine to sustain that level of indebtedness. You know, yes, other countries have much higher debt to GDP ratios, but we're sitting on a narrowing tax base and economic growth that is very anemic. We're not growing in sectors that we need to in order to generate genuinely inclusive growth. And a lot of that comes down to the fact that we don't have effective expenditure, even though there's a lot of money being thrown around. And again, all of this comes back to political accountability, which was our initial kind of starting point. So let me leave it at that, because I know that we are pressed for time, but we could talk about this all day.
I do want us to wrap up in the next few minutes, but as I had indicated to TK and to Mr. Koko there, as well as Sisbafedile, what I want to do now is just to talk briefly about the state of the state-owned enterprises issues within that. Just to load on what Ross was saying, that the president has announced the establishment of a dedicated SOE reform unit to coordinate the work. Are you talking about all of the state-owned enterprises? But there are some challenges still remaining with Eskom, for example, with our rail network, with Transnet and all of that. Do you think that this unit is going to help? TK.
Yeah, hey, it seems like I'm Mr. Negativity, but it's
No,
February.
we told you about this, man.
No, look, I think it's not going to happen. I base this on the fact that I had the pleasure last year, I think, at an event of meeting uh, Ms. Piecha, and she's famous for the Piecha report on state-owned entities. And we had a nice discussion, and she actually laughed. She said, "Look, I hear now there's some new body which was created to reform state-owned entities." And she's like, "It's very odd. We literally got some of the best researchers in the country to do the Piecha report, which was a state-owned entities reform." And all the government needed to do was implement a lot of the things which government is currently speaking about. So the reason I don't have faith in it is because I don't understand what it would seem as though. I think, what does the term youngsters use? Government loves to gaslight itself with new reports. They just get in this room every election year and say, let's gaslight ourselves and come up with a new report. Because literally everybody, and I know Ross, because we met last year at looking at the issues of state-owned entities, we literally have meetings, we have seminars, and we always go back to the PFA report to say government has already done extensive work. So I'm not sure what government is aiming to achieve with this one. And then if you read what the new minister said, she literally said, listen, let's go around the world and do a tour. When I was involved in government's last state-owned entities reform, the PSEC, Presidential State-Owned Entities Council, and literally we got some of the biggest and the best state-owned entities and their CEOs into virtual rooms to say, tell us, how does it work? So I get confused. What is it? It's almost like saying, is there an outcome government wants where if they don't get the answer they want currently, and let's be very honest, state-owned entities in the main are still held by the African National Congress, is an outcome they want. And until they get the outcome that they want, they'll keep asking the same question over and over. So no, I have no faith, because if we could not implement the Piecha report, and this is where I know we always give the former president stick, President Jacob Zuma, because we seem to forget it was him that actually instituted the Piecha report. But it was like 2012, 2011. If you can't implement that, what are you aiming to do differently? So here I have to say, no, government is not serious. And the seriousness is, you can actually, if you read SONA, and I think Ross can correct me, I think state-owned entities were mentioned 3 times only. And within it, it's the same old questions which the president has been asking since he came in. So no, I know. On this one, I'm going to have to be a bit more purposeful and say, no, we're wasting time and they're wasting our time.
Okay, all right. Kaya, and then Susma Fedil, as we wrap up, you can also share your parting shots.
Yeah, look, I'm for the first time in the hour and a half that we've been here, I tend to agree with TK a bit on SOEs. I mean, you look at Transnet, they've been talking about it for how long now? We know what the problems of Transnet are. Specifically, its freight rail component. We went from exporting, let's just take coal, for example. We went from exporting a high of 76 odd million tons in 2017 to about 50 million 2 years ago. If you look at, that's a sharp drop in exports, and we want to talk about beneficiating the raw material that we are exporting. So in essence, we want to raise the amount of exports that we send out using a Transnet, yet we can't get, besides the beneficiated material, we can't get the raw materials to the port to be exported. So there'll be a review after review after review after review. But TK is right, they know what the problems are. With corruption, I mean, the late Minister Pravin Gordhan came in on a wand or a magic broom of cleaning up corruption when he came in initially in 2018. Yet, if you look at his 5-year term, 2019 to 2024, as the Minister of Public Enterprises, just on SAA, Eskom, and Transnet, there was over 227 billion rand in corruption in those 5 years, where he was supposedly leading the cleanup of the SOEs. So that those are the cold hard facts that are provided by the government itself, and the ministries. They just need to implement what they say they're going to implement. Plans after plans won't make a difference. Get the rail infrastructure sorted out. Get the transmission line sorted out. Expand the capacity of energy output that this country has, in order to drive growth. Until that happens, and get professionals, who aren't tied to political interference. TK also mentioned board appointments at SOEs. Those are also largely influenced by political work, and there needs to be a serious skills audit of the people who are in executive management and directors of SOE boards. Until that happens, we'll be having this conversation again in 10 years with the same problems, if not bigger.
Wow. In fact, I was reading a report which is called a roadmap. I think it's for the freight logistics systems in South Africa. It's amazing. The solutions are there. Right, colleagues, I think we've come to the end of our session, but I just now need to give Afedile and then give to Ross, just quickly in less than a few seconds, 30 seconds each, to wrap up, and so that we can say goodbye to our viewers. Your last views.
Thank you, Chair. TK, I also thought about the Pierre report because I've gone through it, because they at one stage I was responsible for the reporting, of the public entities. So I also thought, what happened to that report. But in closing, I would say, Chair, I propose,
yes,
or I'm thinking that there needs to be a change journey, in government. And that journey should not be the problem of the government only. I'm calling all the South African citizens, who rally around government. I know the president has been talking about a dialogue. I'm sure I've heard him 3 times talking about the dialogue. I don't know if it's ever going to happen, but I'm looking for something like that, where because I'm telling you, this government is never going to be okay unless people outside government come in and help the government. It can't help itself anymore.
Sure.
So we need to rally around the government and other proposals that can come up with, because we've got various experts, or in the country, patriotic experts who can help the government to get out of this swamp. So we need to develop, for example, simple things. Let's be practical. Simple things like we identify one department, a prototype or a model department that can be trained, and be used as a showcase to other departments to say, if we say an efficient, an effective department or public servants, we're talking about this. Then that we can also have what we call train the trainer, and then it can spread to the whole government, starting with just one department that will use, as earlier on you asked if we need the Department of Efficiency and Effectiveness. I think we need something like that. Someone, even if it's not a department, but we get experts to come and help us to have this prototype. department.
We have Dr. TK as the head of that Doge department. How is that?
I would go with that, Chair.
Thank you so much. Ross, wrap up for us, man, in a few seconds. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. Look, I'm reminded of how well SARS did. You know, none of us thought that would happen, and it did. Now, of course, there are still structural issues behind the inherent design, the governance design of our SOEs that does need attention. You know, and then we could try and roll that out and see what the fruits of changing the governance structures would be. But my closing remark really is that, you know, political reform, electoral reform especially, is likely to be the thing that precedes all of the difficulties and challenges that we've been talking about addressing. And I say that we should really emphasize that because economic growth, inclusive growth, labor absorptive growth is very unlikely to happen unless we see more political accountability baked into our system. It's on that basis that you can build economic institutions that actually produce real fruit. And our citizens deserve no less. And so I would say that if we were to find one thing in the midst of all of this that really needs serious attention, the GNU has an opportunity to effect it. But of course, it's very difficult for politicians to enact reforms which may undermine their own ability to feed from the trough. But that's a subject for another day. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much to all of you. And I just want to conclude by just reading the last comments here, and then we call it a day. Terence Aronson says, how will the SONA promises be delivered when the cabinet ministers do not have annual performance agreements by which they can be measured? So who is held at cabinet level for the responsible for the lack of delivery? And then there's a response to that from Althea Whitaker to that question or statement. Then Althea says, government works on performance management system. All public servants work on performance agreements and 2 reviews in a financial year. We should be asking, where is it failing short? Clearly, what is clear from the conversations we've had so far is that systems are there mostly, and policies and plans are there, and problems are well defined and understood. But we keep trying to research and trying to do more reports on those problems instead of doing something about implementing the solutions that have already been identified. What is clear also is just the lack of proper consequence management, because there's a lot of things that are always been identified by commissions after commissions, but the changes are not being done. But I also did get to hear that there was a sense in which there are good public servants in the public service that are trying their best to do well. But unfortunately, there's a lot of political interference, interference that causes a lot of problems. But my sense is that people have a desire to have a government that works, a government that is able to deliver on so people are not criticizing for the sake of criticizing, but they are criticizing with the view to say that if you had the commitment, you could turn things around. And so we are going to now transition over the next few days to be looking at how the budget speech is going to enable financially that the priorities that have been identified are going to be delivered. And I think one of the key things that need to happen is we need to have objective measurement by external players, not inside government, who are going to track on the performance against each of the targets, not just from the media point of view, but also from the research institute, from think tanks, from civil society organizations. Because what we're finding is that we always rock up at the State of the Nation address, hoping to hear about what would have been done. But we don't get to start there first and say, okay, we said this last year. Now, this is where we are in terms of that. This is where we're going. And I think that has to be the change that needs to happen in how the State of the Nation is structured so that it can make much more informational impact to us, because it has to mean something. So, colleagues, I want to say thank you so much to our panelists, and I really appreciate your time. Also, to those of you who took time to join us, to our staff here at Good Governance Africa, and as well as to those who commented and participated, and also those that joined and just watched and listened to this. I hope that you are going to partner with us as we do other things. We really appreciate this. We are serious and committed to the establishment of ethical leadership and good governance in Africa. And we believe that if those were to be in place, our continent and our countries would be far, far ahead of where we are now. Thank you so much, and have a great evening, colleagues. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you so much.